My friend Peter Righi, we met at the State Department a couple of years ago at an event. And when I heard Peter speak and talk about entrepreneurship and what's happening around the world, it was incredibly impactful. This is Peter's second time coming back. And his context for entrepreneurship is just absolutely incredible. Because people say a lot that, oh, well, we don't know if we can do this or nobody's doing this. Peter is building entrepreneur networks and connecting people all over the world in places that will absolutely surprise you. And if they can do it there, then what can we do here? So please give a round of applause for my friend Peter Righi.
Well, thank you all, and good morning to everyone. I do understand that I'll have to give a signal to change the slides since I did this in kind of a PDF. And I do apologize for using the podium. As a small disclaimer, and some of you know this, I had actually a very bad sports injury about 6 months ago. I fully ruptured both of my quadricep tendons and tore my quadricep. So I spent 2 months immobilized, learned how to walk again in November. And now it's about 3 months later than that I'm here. So it's not a lot to complain about. It wasn't permanent, but when I got up on stage and I saw that, I was like, that's a death trap for me. So I'd rather not have to explain that to my orthopedist or my wife. Just a matter of background, as Sarah mentioned, I run an organization or a program called CEED, the Centers for Entrepreneurship and Executive Development. But I'm actually employed by a company called SEAF, the Small Enterprise Assistance Funds, which its core business and has been for 25 years is investing in small and medium-sized enterprises in developing markets. We take a minority share in a company, usually do it with equity, sometimes with some convertible instruments. We hold those for 5 to 7, sometimes 10 years, and try to exit those companies, usually via a management buyout for a very fortunate strategic sale. And sometimes some of those companies fail as well. But over the lifetime, the CEEF's had over 400 investments, 200 realizations, which I think is the big game changer for us if we've actually been able to get out of companies in a positive way in very difficult environments. And that's the main business. So the CEED program I'm going to talk a little bit about today in the context of innovation came out of my experience being on the investment side. I would look at, I told many of you, 100 companies and we'd invest in one. And in the markets we were in, it was just tough to see a lot of good family companies coming through that had good revenues, good businesses, but they were just really not targets for investment. They would have been great targets for loans and other kinds of instruments. So I'd see them and then they would disappear. And they had a lot of the same problems or challenges that our investee companies had in terms of management, in terms of delegation, in terms of connections to markets. And I got this idea with a colleague of mine. Couldn't we do something different? Could we come up with a program that takes the knowledge we've kind of amassed and get it to this audience in a better way, but do it in a way that fits their lifestyle? These were companies that they didn't have money to go back and get an MBA, and they didn't have time. So how do you get somebody who doesn't have money or time and a short attention span to, spend some time with you to get some of the information they might need? So we made it very social. We made it really about of, by, and for entrepreneurs. We had successful entrepreneurs who've been through the life cycle of growth in those countries, be the mentors, be the conveyors of knowledge to these companies. And that's just kind of how it got started in Southeast Europe, and now it's in 13 countries. I'm very proud to say these are sustainable local NGOs, so they cover their own costs, and we're looking to expand into other markets. So if you want to flip the slide. These I'll go through very, very quickly, so it won't be death by PowerPoint, as I was telling a colleague of mine this morning. The first half I'm just going to go through very quickly. It's just context. That I think everybody knows that entrepreneurs really are the backbone of kind of healthy economies. Next slide. I think what's important, though, is that in emerging markets, they're really important. In the markets that I have been blessed to work in, there are over and around the world 75 million people, young people in particular, who are unemployed. And in some of the markets I'm working in, up to 50% of those young people do not have work. Next slide. It's a well-known fact that in most of these economies, SMEs are 80% of the economy. Next slide. and they're 80% of the jobs. So if you need a place to focus and where to work, this is where you can have a pretty big impact in terms of sustainable jobs that will be around. Next slide. And I think, from my point of view with my team, maybe coming from that investment background, we realized that entrepreneurs were just the best tool if you're looking at economic development. This was the most dynamic group that could actually affect change in their particular environments. Next slide. In terms of ourselves and passion and what we do, it really comes back to understanding, why that these entrepreneurs really are. Next slide. That catalyst. And in the mission, it can get very convoluted. If you're doing investment, you're doing human capital development, what are you really doing? And I really summarized it with the CEED team and the CEED team and said, really, what are we doing at the end of the day? Who cares if it's investment or if it's a training or if it's connecting a market envoy? At the end of the day, what's the goal? You're trying to improve lives and communities through entrepreneur-led development. That's the demographic, and they are the catalyst of that change. And so how do we do that? Like I said, we train, we connect, we mentor these companies because they're the ones that are going to create the jobs. They're the ones that actually accelerate economic prosperity. And the way we approach it is really with a community-based approach. Next slide. I won't bore you with this. I did this for alliteration purposes so that I could remember. We had a lot of different services, and I said, well, I don't understand what they all are. So we had to kind of get them down to like 4 things. It's either going to fall into capacity building, which can be a variety of different things, connections, local and international, the community, which is those peer relationships in those markets, which are not to be underestimated how powerful they can be. And then ultimately, in terms of capital, I leave that to my counterparts on the investment side, but we do try to prepare companies for the right kind of finance they need, which oftentimes is not equity. It might be debt, it's something else. Next slide. These are just an idea of the products that we do. The point behind this is just that we don't do subjects. We do things based upon where you are in your growth path. So if you're in the beginning stages, and I'm asking you to be part of this program, and I'll be clear, I'm asking you to pay to be part of this program, your expectations rise. So you're saying, okay, great, what do I get now? How is this relevant? What am I going to get tomorrow? And if this doesn't lead to some sales or other things, I'm out. So I have to win them over. Our teams have to win them over pretty quickly. And then as they have some success, then you can bring them up to scale in terms of professionalizing and then maybe even looking at global opportunities. Next slide. We've been doing this for 10 years, so the impact's starting to become a little more significant. The 60% number, I think, is actually inaccurate. It should say 60% of companies get business via the network, not with each other, because they're from a diversified group. They don't necessarily, I don't sell to Stan, but Stan knows Sarah, and through Stan, I get to Sarah. So that's kind of how it works. Next slide. That's a terrible, terrible slide in this environment. I guess the idea is just to see if you can imagine we are in the light green markets are where I have centers on the ground and staff. I have over 50 staff. And then I leverage the CEEF investment network, which are the countries in blue. And the stars are just markets where neither of us were in terms of teams on the ground, but we did a lot of work with our companies in terms of either envoys, connections, connecting these companies. Next slide. This is just validation in terms of people who are supporting what we're doing. Next slide. But I think what you're here for today is a lot to continue the conversation we had yesterday about innovation. And when I look at what we have here, I look at it and see it a lot around ultimately human interaction. That's really what all of this really kind of boils down to. In these, when I look at the companies that we're working, I call it a community of the curious, but ultimately it's a place where companies are going and whether it's with us or anybody else, where they're creating that social network, where they're getting access to people who could be part of their teams. They have different complementary skill sets. You're finding in other individuals, and they're kind of from different backgrounds, a diverse background, different perspectives, different ways of making economic decisions. And then ultimately is the environment. And that environment has to be one that really engenders trust, so you get to know people pretty well. And also is an environment that is hard sometimes to predict exactly where this is going to come out. So I think you called it creative collisions yesterday was the phrase. I don't know if I'd use that, but definitely when something starts, you don't necessarily know where it's going to end. Next slide. I don't think you have to teach entrepreneurs when it comes to innovation or collaboration how to do that. They kind of know how to do that intuitively. Next slide. But barriers do exist. And I see these barriers, at least in the markets that I work in overseas, as formal and informal. And the formal ones are ones that you all know: access to finance, access to inputs, access to talent. But in our markets, there's another big barrier, which are the entrepreneurs themselves. Over 65% of startups in the markets that I work in fail due to people, not conditions. And that's sometimes a question of either risk tolerance, the ability to actually execute, the ability to pull some of that talent together that they might have. But it's confidence, could be. But that's not to be underestimated how important it is to have an entrepreneur who gets some of the soft skills that are necessary to be successful in the marketplace. Next slide. I think the key one, though, if someone asks me all the work that we do as it relates to the entrepreneurs and to innovation, our currency is really trust. At the end of the day, I'm trying to make these things sustainable, but the trust is what makes everything else work. Once you've spent time with people, and I'll give you an example, I work in 4 Muslim countries right now. And if I can be very stereotyped for a moment, people trust their family, they trust their friends, and they trust other people they have financial leverage over, not anybody else. So I'll know you, but I'm not going to trust you with my secrets or my vulnerabilities and things like that. And that's, again, generalization, it's a stereotype. But what I have found when we were doing CEED and putting groups together of people who didn't necessarily know each other, it was hard. It was hard at first. But when they realized that they had some of the same challenges, and people start to see how other people start to problem solve, and you start to build confidence and you in relationships over time, then the peer thing starts to take on a life of its own. And that's where that trust really, really moves to another level. When I just came from Slovenia, I always do a little bit of sampling with entrepreneurs and say, well, what's CEED to you? Because I have an idea what I think it is, and then I hear from the customer, and it's usually something different. And they said things to me like, Pete, it's a home. It's a place where I can exhale, I can learn. I like this one: pain relief for entrepreneurs. I didn't realize we were Advil. Or entrepreneurial lifeline. So this is a place where they're going in their busy lives because they get the right advice, and it's a place where you don't have to keep up all the fronts outside in the world. You can actually, let your hair down a little bit and try to figure something out. Next slide. This one I'm completely taking from a friend of mine, Victor Huang, who's now wrote a book called The Rainforest, and he's now, I believe, at the Kauffman Foundation and a VP for entrepreneurship. And Victor really schooled me a few years ago when I went out and spent some time with him in California. When we were talking about innovation and what's needed, he talked about the different paradigms. And he's like, it's not only is it changing, a lot of what we heard yesterday from some of our colleagues, but just that you really need to understand how quickly it's changing, and that this is really the catalyst in how innovation happens. You've got to move from the kind of command and control to this one that's a lot harder to predict, where like these teams are creating together. You have to fail fast. You have to experiment, adapt, iterate. We all hear those terms, but it's another thing to actually create environments or be in environments where that's happening in a dynamic way. Next slide. And this is how Victor explained it to me. I didn't get it at first, and he said, look to the right. He goes, that's the plantation maximizes yield and very precise controlled method. He goes, the rainforest thrives through uncontrolled process. And he goes, that's not what state or national governments want to hear, because it's hard to put money out and say, what result am I going to get at the end of it? It's more the idea of kind of using creative things, some of the things I heard yesterday, like around the homeless in Denver, where the private sector has to kind of do things. And then if they're successful, maybe the government underwrites at the end of that and does some sort of guarantee. But that's kind of what he was getting at, is that you can't always predict, but you can have intentional serendipity. You can create spaces and places online, in person, for people to get together, but you can't always predict where it's gonna go, and that's not a bad thing. Next slide. At the end of the day, the whys, those are kind of self-explanatory, but it's really about, transforming the culture. It leads, like I said, fast failure, adoption of best practices, more diversity of ideas and collaboration, so that you can solve some of these problems. And I always say, at the end of the day, if you're having some sort of innovative process or creating a space for innovation, even within your company, it doesn't have to always be outside, you're going to have better employees. You're going to have people who want to take some chances. within obviously calculated bounds. But it's a better thing overall for the company, and even for in my case, these countries in terms of revenues, jobs, or improving tax base. Next slide. I wanted to use like 2 or 3 examples. And I don't know if you'd call these innovation or collaboration, but these are examples that I have. Like I said, I run CEED, but I work for this patient capital provider called CEEF. And oftentimes we're in parallel worlds. I have pipeline for them in certain markets, and I do value addition for some of their investee companies, but we're kind of on sometimes separate tracks. Partly because of the size of investment. Their ticket size is $1 to $3 million and sometimes goes even higher. And a lot of times my clients are, in the beginning, under $1 million. They're too small. And then they quickly grow and become almost too big sometimes for CEEF. Next slide. But this is a good example of where we kind of found a way to work together. This is a company called Abbey Nutrition, which is a CEEF investee in the feed area, chicken feed and livestock feed in eastern India. And what was really interesting about this, besides the entrepreneur who's kind of a character in his own right, is that they basically came up with I wouldn't call it completely new, but they patented a new way of detoxifying cottonseed oil as a protein input into chicken feed. I grew up in a rural area, so chicken feed's not that unfamiliar to me. You need a carbohydrate base, you need a protein base. And a lot of times on certain markets, the protein base is the most expensive and the hardest to get. And so either you do it with fish meal oil, or if you can afford it, you use soybean. But it's expensive. And what they came up with was a way that basically was saving their small farmer, their customers, up to 30, 35%. It had some great benefits in terms of less water usage. And we actually helped them expand into the next nearby market in Bangladesh. Next slide. But what was really interesting here was what I called a south-south solution. Oftentimes, we would have we were doing an investment. I have a seed center in Tanzania, and we were working a lot in ag, and we looked at a feed producer. It's an industry we know well. And the first thing you think about is, well, what's Cargill doing in this space? What are other groups doing in this space? And we weren't even thinking right next door that we had a potential solution. And when we did this investment in Hill, the company that's pictured here, they're Dar-based, but they have a lot of operations outside the capital area. They were very interested as they learned more about what we had done in India. And we kind of connected those companies together. And now they're basically taking that technology and using it as their protein input. And it's really, not only in terms of, if you go to the next slide, if it goes, this is kind of a messy slide, but not only is it helping to reduce their feed costs by up to 30%, but it has a huge input in terms of the company and its supply chain. So you have a higher protein, a lower cost cake in this market, which is not only good for the poultry farmer, so now I get something that's hopefully more nutritious for the chickens that I'm feeding, but also for the maize suppliers. All of a sudden, if people are buying more complex chicken feed, there's a market for my corn that's needed as the carbohydrate base behind it. And then, not to extrapolate or have too much attribution, but ideally you'd have healthier chicks, healthier eggs, healthier meat. And if that gets into people's diets, all of a sudden you have a more consistent protein levels in people's diets in Tanzania. Next slide. This company is another example of innovation I talked about yesterday. Of innovation can also be inspiration and reinterpretation. It doesn't have to be something completely new. Besides the terrible, terrible name he chose, because every time I see CVS Mobile, I always think like the CVS mobile app. It has nothing to do with that. Surreal was a truck driver in Germany 12 years ago. He has I don't think he actually graduated college. I think he did some studies in informatics, but he didn't actually graduate. And when he was in Germany at that time, in the early 2000s, he was seeing some of the telematics systems that were there in terms of GPS and tracking. He was just really interested. And he thought to himself, I can do that. And we have none of that back in Slovenia and the Balkans. We had none of that stuff at that time. So he came back, got some friends and family, started to build this company in the telematics space for tracking systems, for fleet management, and he really built it. And now it does the service for the vehicles, the cargo locations. It optimizes your travel routes for fuel efficiency. When I met him, he had 3 employees in Slovenia, outside Ljubljana. Now he's got 100 employees, And he's all over the Balkans, Algeria, UAE, Nigeria, and Cameroon. And what's interesting for a lot of for me, working with a lot of the Balkan entrepreneurs, is they'll go anywhere. They don't even have to know about those markets. If someone calls them up in Cameroon and says, I think I might be interested in what you're doing, these guys are on the next plane. They're not going to wonder, is this the right environment? They'll go, and they're hustlers, which is what's necessary. But what I liked about it was it wasn't brand new. This was not rocket science. He just took the idea, improved upon it a bit, and reapplied it in his market and became a first mover. Next slide. This is one I presented a couple of years ago. And maybe it's more about collaboration than innovation, but what I liked about it was Salima, she's a very impressive person, but she left a very well-paying job at a fast-moving consumer goods company in France to move back home, which was a big deal to her family because they kept thinking, like, why would you possibly leave this well-paying job to come home and start a business that you don't know if it'll work or not? And she started her more of a cosmetics business really out of the basement of her mom's pharmacy. And she focused on two things that are pretty well known in the international markets now, that Morocco has argan oil, and it has these kind of specialty clays that are often used in makeup. And she realized that a lot of them were either just being inputs to multinationals, but if you wanted to do your own brand, the Moroccans needed better packaging, branding, and distribution. And Salima knew enough about the market that she said, I want to focus on export, because if I stay in the Moroccan market, it's cash-based, it's consignment-based, this is kind of a race to the bottom for me. So she hustled very hard and got some good contracts in Dubai and was selling in the Middle East. So by the time I met her, she was, well, in terms successful. But she came to us because she said, I'm stuck and I need some quick answers. I don't know how to go beyond where I am now. I don't know if it's a question of money. I don't know if it's a question of distribution. I'm stuck. And when she came into the program, we had some ideas on kind of how to assist her a bit. This is where the collaboration, the intentional serendipity, things happen that you don't always expect. She met a guy named Dries, I'm killing his last name, Krafes, who's actually a University of Florida Gainesville graduate from Morocco. Went back home and he runs his family's distribution company, and those two met. And they were talking about their products. He talked a lot about how he likes to try to place Moroccan products in the US market, and they hit it off, and together they did a joint venture, and now she's actually selling some of her products here in the US. But I think the innovative side to it is the part that's less known, is to get some of these inputs. They're not in Casablanca or Rabat in any of the business areas. They're kind of far out to get. And usually they're in kind of rural communities, and oftentimes people rely on, I don't want to use the word collectives, but groups of women and others to kind of get the materials. And Salima, I did not know this at the time, but through her relatives, is actually from some of these regions. And oftentimes they're also Berber regions, which are a minority within the Moroccan environment, and oftentimes not always get the best access. And so what she did to kind of work with a group of between 150 to 200 women to get some of the inputs is she changed the makeup of her company. She took about 30 to 40% of the company and made that available to that supplier group and let them own 30% of her company, which I don't know many people who would do that, but I was really impressed. And that was a way to basically maybe lock in supply, to be fair, but I think she really had another way of looking at the world and said, I want to do this and be successful financially, export this, but I think I can do something that can make a big difference in the communities that I'm leveraging that are helping to make me successful. So that was kind of a cool story in terms of impact. Next slide. And the last one, I'll just say this is innovation that comes from experience. We've been in Morocco now for 5 years, building pipeline. Now finally CEED, my parent company, is looking at it and saying, we're still really in the growth stage, but what you have there is interesting. How do we work closer together? And so one of the things I realized in that market, my team and I realized, is that to get to when we say growth phase there, we mean in the above $1 million investment. There are some players. Not many, but there are some players. But below that, there's nobody. I mean, there are very few angels. There are some accelerators and incubators. There are ways to get 50,000, maybe 100,000, but not much more. So there's a huge valley of death. And in looking at our learnings, I talked with people at USAID, and they had a program in Lebanon and Iraq that they were doing, and they decided to leverage what we were doing and apply it in Morocco. And really what this was about was a fund at that level, the economics really don't work. You know, an 80-20, they don't work. But if it's subsidized to a degree, and your objective is to really catalyze other local investment, and if that's your metric, then you might have some interesting results. So what we're doing now, and we're actually launching it in March, is a program whereby we're doing investments in the $100,000 to $500,000 space. I have a lot of pipeline for that one. But most importantly was, how do you catalyze other high net worth individuals to put money in? It's pretty hard to do. If you started in a country tomorrow and said, I'm going to go get 10, 20 rich guys or gals to put money into companies, not easy. But the advantage we have is that we've been working with 25 to 50 high net worth individuals for 5 years. I've never asked them for a dime. They've gotten used, they've worked with these companies out of their own free time. I have a lot of Jorges where I am. And so now, when we're coming to a point where they're thinking about putting in $100,000 on a deal, $200,000 on a deal, they don't want to be the lead per se. They'd rather have your name out there, not theirs. But now they're aware of the pipe. They know how good these companies are. And they're also more aware of the risk that they're involved in. They're not doing this thinking, oh, if I have to have control so I can get all my money back or more. They understand the risk of what they're getting into. But that's a natural evolution of being in the market for a long period of time. So I guess I will just close by saying this, that in terms of innovation, there are a lot of ways to do it. I think we talked a lot about that yesterday with saying yes, being open. But what I have seen abroad is a lot of times it's a question of that human interaction. It's creating the circumstances for them to get together, and not just once, to get together on a continuous basis, to start to build relationships with each other, relationships that start to lead to trust, so that good things can happen. Thank you for your time.